All right. Looks like we're now completely live for the August AMA. So I let my hair down a little bit today. You can see how long it is. And I've got a lot of questions lined up. So I'll say a few things at the start. You don't need to ask a question more than once. If it's in there, it's in the thing. And I'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the time that we have lined up, which is approximately 90 minutes. So let's start off with John Holloway's question. Can you recommend any specific Stoic writings on regret or on guilt? No, nothing in particular comes to mind, although I would suspect that maybe there's some letter by Seneca that actually touches on the topics. It's weird because I've been getting asked similar questions, and it may be by the same person or by other people recently. It seems to be a topic of some interest and concern. I mean, the first thing to do is, you can realize that there's nothing you can do to change the past. All you can do is focus on what you choose to do in the present. And, you think about if there's things that you feel regret or guilt about, obviously you're making a judgment that you're then applying to yourself. And you could think, well, is this judgment correct? Have I just sort of inherited assumptions from other people that might be questionable? But let's say there is something to feel objectively guilty about or regret. You did something that you're like, oh man, that was bad. Well, then you look at why you did it. Look at your reasoning process so you can change your habits and assumptions and decisions for the future, because that's what you actually have control over. But there's no particular Stoic treatise on that or chapter or letter that I can think of that comes to mind, although maybe I'm leaving something out. But Little Yell says, what are some good pieces or arguments for the veneration of the saints? Catholic thought is rigorous and quite interesting, but I've never understood that particular aspect. So Catholic thought is not something that exists. You can't generalize adequately about a religious tradition and community that has been going on for 2,000 years and includes just thousands of different writers that are sort of at the top tier, and then many more. So I would always avoid generalizing about Catholic thought, because just take some of the key thinkers from the Middle Ages. Anselm is not Abelard, is not Aquinas, is not Augustine, is not, and we could go down the list. And those are just a few of them, right? The idea about the veneration of the saints is that the saints provide exemplars and are part of a community. I mean, if you wanted to read a book, I would suggest looking at St. Anselm's Prayers and Meditations, translated by Benedicta Ward. I think there's a new translation that's coming out soon. Anselm writes a lot of his prayers, which are intended to be used by not only himself, but others. They circulated around as a very popular collection. He revolutionizes prayer and revolutionizes, you could say, the approaches to the saints in a very sophisticated and well thought out way. The saints are understood as being, people who started out as sinners and screw-ups like the rest of us, and somehow, progressed in some way. And I mean, veneration, that's kind of a side note, really. The key things are to think about what it is that you want to get out of contemplating these people, I would say, and then think about whether there is something like a communion, meaning a capacity for relationship and ongoing dialogue or something along those lines. Joseph says, who do you think has the more correct view on space and time, Kant or Aristotle? Especially interested in your take on the transcendental aesthetic as I'm reading it right now. I mean, I'm not a Kantian. I don't buy the idea that space and time are merely forms of, our perception of the world, and we kind of just impose them on the booming, buzzing craziness that is whatever reality is. I'm more of a realist that way than a Kantian idealist. Does Aristotle corner the market on space and time? I mean, it's not even clear sometimes, other than, really cool lapidary formulas like time is the number of motion. But then you got to go like, well, what the hell does that mean, right? And spell that out. I mean, I guess you could say I would lean more towards Aristotle, but there's other thinkers who come after him who likewise speculate about the nature of time. Think about Augustine in Confessions, towards the end of the book, the metaphysical chapters or books of the work. And there's lots of other thinkers who consider it as well. So it's sort of like asking me, which do you like better on pizza? Mushrooms or just pineapple? And I'd be like, well, not really a fan of either, by themselves. So that might be I don't know if that's a decent answer. Mark says, wanted to share, we had our first meeting for a new local existentialism reading group yesterday. It was great fun. Thank you for continuing to inspire us to put philosophy into practice. Well, that's really cool. So Mark is in South Africa. He's a friend and colleague of mine, and a local existentialism reading group. That sounds pretty cool. I don't think that we have something like that here in the Milwaukee area, although I could be mistaken. Maybe I need to look on meetups and see whether we have something like that. So I applaud you for putting something like that together. We're having, at least I'm having trouble, coordinating our local Stoic fellowship, in part because it's difficult to find a good place to meet post COVID. But yeah, that's really cool. All right, Galen, how should I read the Euthydemus? It seems ridiculous, and I suppose it's meant to be. Is it a critique of sophists, a message that philosophy is important and just ignore the idiots, both or or other? It's a critique of the sophists. I mean, Plato writes a lot of dialogues. If you don't enjoy the Euthydemus, I don't think you need to read it or reread it, given that there's so many other dialogues that are considered, historically more central to the Platonic tradition than the Euthydemus. It's sort of like saying, what's supposed to be going on here in this storage closet, and we got the whole house to go through. It is a critique of the sophists, and it's a critique in action where Socrates does some takedowns. And so, how should you read it? There's lots of ways to read a Platonic dialogue. You can say, I just want the arguments, the way that analytic philosophers do. You can say that the dramatic context matters, and you don't have to be a Straussian, thank God, to do that, because people have been attending to that, forever. You can look at the key ideas that are being developed and whether you can go further with them. You can think about the nature of philosophy versus sophistry. There's lots of ways to take any Platonic dialogue and go somewhere with it. There doesn't have to be just one thing. And, like you say, it seems ridiculous, and I suppose it's meant to be. So parts of it are ridiculous in the sense that, they're meant to raise a laugh, right? Ridicule has to do with rhesus, with laughter. And yeah, we're supposed to laugh at these sophists who are claiming to know everything, claiming to do everything. I mean, this is a bit of a side note, but these two jackass brothers, they are like the sophists, right? So think about the other so-called sophists that we run across. Gorgias doesn't claim to do anything other than teach rhetoric, right? He's pretty circumspect in his claims. Thrasymachus can teach you about justice. Does he know about everything else? No. But these guys can talk about anything and everything. And so, they're kind of ripe for takedowns, I would say. A lot of questions. Just skipped a little bit. So Jeremy Armento, thoughts on philosophy of math? I don't really have a lot of thoughts on philosophy of math. It's a cool area. I'm not a specialist in it. So that's pretty much it. Thoughts on anarcho-syndicalism and socialism? Well, two different things. And it depends on what we mean by socialism. Here in America, unfortunately, we have a tradition of conservatives in the past and fake conservatives in the present, because people who call themselves conservatives today are not conservative at all. They've left behind, most of what counted as conservatism. They use the word socialist to describe anything that they don't like, that might have government involved, or stuff like that. But socialism can be done in many different ways. I think that there are some things where the state ought to be in control of it. We shouldn't privatize it. We shouldn't try to look for free market solutions, because they always end up being crony capitalism and corruption and monopolies and stuff like that, which is not proper capitalism. And I think that we should think about the impact of things on the entire community, and we should try to have policies that are much more oriented towards the ordinary person than rich elites. And I think we should tax the shit out of elites at this point too. And I don't buy they're going to go elsewhere. They already go elsewhere. They already find ways to evade it. One way you could look at socialism would be people pay their fair share for the benefits that they're receiving just by being within a society. So I'm cool with that. All right, Yoda, what do you think about the U.S. China-Taiwan issue? I think that China should decide, that Taiwan is always going to be off limits. I think Taiwan should be recognized at this point as an independent country with its own economy, with its own mix of cultures, with its own history. And I think that, there's kind of a good consensus among all of China's neighbors that China's overstepping. I mean, it's bad enough what they've done to Tibet. It's bad enough what they're doing to minorities, not just in Xinjiang, but historically throughout the place. And it's bad enough what went on in Hong Kong, right? I don't want to see that sort of crap happening with Taiwan. And yeah, that's probably enough to say about it. Erickson Brown, how great and important of a philosopher is Wittgenstein in your opinion? I think that Wittgenstein is worth reading, but I think that his importance was greatly oversold as a result of the kind of self-impoverishment of philosophy that is characteristic of early analytic philosophy, with some exceptions. John Wisdom, Anscombe, Foote, people like that show that you can, McIntyre too, show that you can do work in an analytic context and engage with people outside of analytic philosophy. I think that Wittgenstein, had he read and seriously thought about many more people in the history of philosophy, he wouldn't have spent so much time trying to reinvent wheels and doing a so-so job of doing that. But his works are interesting and challenging and worth checking out. So yeah, a lot of these, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about the philosophy of science? I don't have any thoughts about the philosophy of science. I don't work in the philosophy of science. These are far too general. What do you think of fuzzy logic? I guess it's good for some things. I wouldn't adopt it as the be all and end all of logic. Massac says, which Christian secular scholar do you agree with in terms of the distortion of the Bible, especially the Old Testament? I don't know. I mean, I'm not spending a lot of time reading up to date stuff, criticism, whether it's form or I don't even remember all the different things that it fits into. So I don't have a particular scholar who I agree with in terms of a distortion of the Bible, which is, ask me about a particular book and something like that. Maybe I can give you an answer. Oldies, any book or other resources, recommendations to start learning logic? Depends on what kind of logic you want to learn. Um, there's a lot of things that get called logic, and there is no absolute consensus among philosophers about exactly what logic is or how far it extends. There's overlaps with what we call critical thinking, with communication studies, with rhetoric, with dialectic, with other fields as well. So I would say, like, if your goal is to study formal logic, there's textbooks out there. And I haven't done a survey of that for a long time because I haven't taught logic classes for quite a while. But standby, or the sort of standard when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, was Copy. And Copy's Introduction to Logic has gone through many, many editions. It's a good book. Hurley is a big favorite of many others as well. But yeah, I mean, most logic textbooks are going to cover more or less the same kind of stuff, with a few variations, right? So find yourself a decent logic textbook and just kind of plow away with that. And then if you're interested in the connections of logic with other stuff, again, Copy wrote quite a bit about that. I remember going through pretty much everything I could find by the guy when I was an undergraduate. If you're interested in going beyond just formal logic and Aristotelian logic, then Graham Priest is somebody who you should check out. He's got a introduction to, I think it's non-standard logics, which talks about a lot of cool stuff. There's modal logic as well, which Priest will cover, but other people will have like entire textbooks on. And then, if you're thinking about like logic and argumentation, you might check out people like Umberto Eco, or Chaim Perlman, who are attentive to where logic intersects with semiotics or intersects with rhetoric or things like that. So those might be a good place to get started. Emergence as a Means says, what do you make of the assumption of a need to create conditions of rigor like that of the sciences in philosophy? It seems to me like a relatively common but deeply limited persuasion. Okay, so this is a great question. To begin with, if you look at the history of the sciences, you realize that, or if you know scientists who currently work, or you think about how science gets presented, you realize that rigor is something that is occasionally attained, sometimes is kind of a straitjacket preventing people from, progressing in the sciences and considering interesting explanations for things or cool experiments to carry out. Rigor is kind of a buzzword, and sometimes it means something and sometimes it doesn't. In the hands of philosophers who are enamored of the sciences, much of the time you can be guaranteed that they don't really know enough of the sciences to make that comparison, and that what's going on here is more of a wish fulfillment ideology than anything else. A way of like saying what we do is rigorous, what you do isn't, So I'm pretty skeptical of those sorts of claims. We also have to deal with the fact that science isn't a single thing. It doesn't boil down to the quote scientific method, which doesn't actually cover the methods that scientists have used and do use. Doesn't all proceed the way that, in this cookie cutter way that we teach people in textbooks and as undergraduates or in high school or stuff like that. So I'm pretty skeptical of that sort of thing. Your average French Canadian immigrant recently discovered my cousin is an incel, debating him was useless. Can you recommend a philosophy psychoanalysis book that talks about the metaphysics of bigotry, essence of a woman as acts and facts, either explicitly endorsed or temporarily? I don't know what all of this is asking, frankly. The metaphysics of bigotry, I'm not even sure what that would mean. I mean, you mentioned Fanon. He's worth reading. There's lots of stuff out there that talks about maybe what you mean by the metaphysics of bigotry is like the thought processes behind it. I think there's lots and lots of stuff out there that you could look at, going all the way back to, I mean, think about like Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche identified the anti-Semites of his time for the morons that they were, but also the pan-Germanists as well. But going forward, there's all sorts of ways to identify what's happening, and not just in philosophy, but like sociology and in literature, in the fine arts. So I don't have any particular recommendations of that, but yeah, I mean, going back to your original point, discovered my cousin is an incel. So, and debating him, that means that you were trying to like convince him otherwise. And I'm guessing that he's espousing all sorts of stuff that he's like read on websites or in shitty books about like, the nature of women and the nature of men, and buying into, like women, dating apps have destroyed everything because of hypogamy and blah, 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 right? You're probably not going to make much progress with a person like that, and debating them certainly isn't going to be the way to go. People's minds are very, very infrequently changed by debates, I would say. So maybe it's like offering better examples and putting up with his silly bullshit, but also like laying limits down on it. Like when he says, for example, I got a biological dad who I love very much, but who watches Fox News, and whenever he brings up, the latest thing from Fox News, I'll just say, well, I don't think that's true. And then, the conversation pauses for a bit, and then we move on to better topics. So, when he starts talking about like why he can't get a girlfriend because of blah, 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 that some, huckster has put out there to draw an audience and make money, you say, well, that's not true. And I don't see any point in debating this with you. Love you as a cousin, but this is going to be an unproductive conversation. So, if this is all we're going to talk about, I guess I'll see you. If we got other stuff to talk about, let's talk about that. If you do those sorts of things, then you leave the door open to eventually them moving on to something better. ADN, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on moral Platonism? What are its shortcomings? Is it tenable as positing God a superior moral theory? I have no idea what you're talking about as moral Platonism. That is not a term that I've seen out there. I expect that must be something from somebody's rather eccentric classification of moral systems or something like that. Positing God is not a moral theory. That's, God would be just a component of a moral theory, not a whole moral theory in itself. And I'm curious why you think that Platonists don't believe in God when clearly they do, because Plato talks about the gods many, many times in his works, and the form of the good winds up in Christian and Jewish Neoplatonism being God. So I'm not sure where that's coming from. Dominic, I want to thank you for your work. I applied for the PhD again after 3 years and was accepted. Nice. Congratulations. Because of your lectures, my fire for philosophy has never been extinguished. So that's awesome to read. Ideally the lectures are just a supplement for the works that they're referencing and explaining. So, hopefully you've been reading a lot of great philosophical works in those 3 years as well. You're definitely going to need it going into the PhD, right? All right, Andre, since you're an eclectic, I assume you don't buy Stoicism wholesale. What are the things you leave outside and why? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare to find somebody who actually does buy Stoicism wholesale. Because the classic Stoics didn't all do that. Think about Seneca, where he will say, for example, the orthodox Stoic position is that the virtues are living things within us, and clearly that doesn't make any sense, and here's some arguments why. So, orthodoxy in Stoicism is as tricky as orthodoxy in any other community as well. Um, I mean, I think you could say that I differ, first of all, on a number of points where the people who call themselves in the present traditional Stoics are real sticklers. I don't buy the pantheism, you know. I don't, even if we like change it to panentheism and have, as we would get from Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, kind of a hierarchy of beings that looks a little bit more Platonic or Neoplatonic or Aristotelian, where you've got these, you know, lowercase g gods that look a lot like angels helping out running the universe. I don't think that this is a really tenable schema. Um, you know, I think that the Stoics are maybe a bit too, um, what would we call it? A bit too uncompromising about some of the emotions, particularly anger. I lean more towards the position that you see Aristotelians and Platonists and Epicureans and a lot of you know, early Christian writers having about anger, which is you really got to watch it, and it's problematic a lot of the time. But the Stoics are wrong to condemn it entirely. The position, by the way, of rational emotive behavior therapy as well. Um, um, you know, I think that the Stoic discussions of the virtues are great. I think that the idea that you're either vicious or virtuous and there's nothing in between, and that although virtues might, you know, augment in a certain way, you can't actually like grow in them. So like one instance of justice is just as good as another instance of justice. I don't buy any of that. I'm actually going to be doing a presentation on that in the Midwest Seminar in Ancient and Medieval Philosophy later this fall, um, over at Marquette University. So if you're here locally, you can hear me talk about that. Um, I mean, what else do I differ with them on? Um, I don't know that I buy the anthropology that they have with the like single ruling part and then the senses and stuff like that. I'm kind of more attracted to a faculty psychology like you see in Platonism and Aristotelianism. Um, so I mean that's probably more or less it. There's probably more stuff, but I'd have to think about that. All right. Salvador, as a Catholic, how do you reconcile us having a soul with its attribute independent of our body and the fact that our brains determines the latter so much? I sort of like Bergsonian dualism thoughts. I don't even know what Bergsonian dualism is supposed to mean because I don't necessarily get that out of reading Bergson. Um, I don't have to reconcile having a soul independent of the body and the brain determining the latter so much because those don't strike me as contradictory. Um, brain can determine the body and determine the soul. I mean, there's lots of different explanations for what could exceed the brain. You know, going all the way back to, I suppose, Aristotle, right? Who was not a dualist in any sense. So to me, this isn't something I really worry about much. Bruno, I'm reading Leotard. I'm finding him unconvincing so far. Any thoughts on him? I never was really able to get into Leotard, and I think it might be I just couldn't appreciate the stuff that he was doing. I got to go back and reread the postmodern condition just to, you know, own up a little bit. But I've always find reading him kind of a chore, frankly. So, you know, and he seems to me a little bit like, and this is a common thing for um, French philosophy of his generation. He's really willing to, you know, in a critical way, take on all these other thinkers and then use their stuff. And sometimes it's revealing. And a lot of times you're like, well, why did you go down that route instead of this route? So 1117 says, are there any modern phenomenological philosophers you like? Yeah, lots of them. Depends on what you mean by modern, right? So there's lots of people in the phenomenological movement as it gets started. I mean, Husserl's important. I find reading Husserl really boring and dry, except for a few pieces. He does actually have a really good encyclopedia entry on phenomenology, though. But there's a lot of people of his generation that are also, really great to read, like Max Scheler, his student Edith Stein, who, by the way, was the invited guest for the first day of Thomist Studies, a sort of transnational meeting that took place, I want to say 1932. She was the guest of honor, and she was, engaging with them on that. There were quite a few Thomists who were attracted to phenomenology. Foiling is a good example of one, Aimé Foret. And that's in part because what phenomenology was doing is very similar to what Bergson was doing and what Maurice Blondel before Bergson was doing with the method of immanence. And Bergson and Blondel, along with Gabriel Marcel, also a phenomenologist, effectively revitalized metaphysics in France in the early 20th and late 19th century. Obviously, Heidegger is very important. Jean-Paul Sartre is a phenomenologist. Ortega y Gasset is not a phenomenologist as such, I would say, but certainly learned from them quite a bit. And we can keep going on and on and on and on, right? There's still people out there doing phenomenology today, including many of my friends and colleagues. One just down the road at Marquette, Sebastian Luft, is heavily involved in the phenomenological community. So there's a lot of phenomenologists that I like, including some of my colleagues. All right. Miroslav, any thoughts on the works of Hans-Georg Gadamer? Worth reading. Interesting guy. In the phenomenological tradition, so to speak, doing the hermeneutic stuff. Student of Heidegger, and has got some good works on Platonic dialogue, good discussions of Hegel. Obviously, his book Truth and Method, worth reading as well. Matthew says, I wanted to ask about your perspective on the natural humanist philosophers from the Renaissance, particularly Neoplatonic, esoteric, natural philosophy such as Agrippa or Pico. Not a specialist in that stuff. I don't really have a perspective on that. So there are people out there who do that. As a matter of fact, I did have a colleague at one time at Marist who was a specialist in Renaissance philosophy, but you're not going to find a lot of people doing that sort of thing. Aose, do you have any tips for reading philosophy faster? I started reading philosophy recently, and it took me an hour and 30 minutes to read 2 pages. I plan to stick with it. I do. And my advice is don't read philosophy faster. Read it at the pace that it requires. It's sort of like saying, do you have any advice for cleaning my house faster? And you walk into it and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, yeah, you can go faster and do a shoddy job that is going to require you to like fix it later anyway, or you can do it right the first, second, third time. And that's the better way to go. If you find that a passage takes a while, that's just fine. It takes us all a while, just as an example. So like I've got here's 2 books at 2 different extremes. Here's J.G. Ballard. I'm going to be doing a Worlds of Speculative Fiction next Saturday, specifically on this book and 2 other ones, Crash and High Rise. And, this is not only is this a novel, so you can read it fairly quickly anyway, but Ballard is a a writer who makes reading kind of effortless. So, I mean, you could read this in less than the space of an afternoon, right? Here's another book that's a little bit of a contrast on the other end. I mean, sometimes reading through a paragraph could take an hour to figure out what the hell this guy is actually saying, and that's okay. Some other stuff that would be like maybe in between. A great author like Julia Annas. This is a difficult, dense book. It is not including all the bibliography and stuff like that. 451 pages with lots and lots of notes, but really well worth reading. I highly recommend Julia Annas. Great person too. I've met her and interacted with her. It takes what it takes. Don't try to speed things up. People who advise you to like cut corners, they're giving you bad advice. So, right, ridicule. Would you support democratizing the workplace / a shift towards more worker cooperatives and representation? Yeah, I think that would be a great thing. I think that we also, democratizing isn't enough because we also need to think about the legal framework that has changed so much over my lifetime, making things, much more difficult for workers in many respects and easier for corporations and management in many respects. We need to think about the culture that we're in, where a lot of people vote against their economic interests because they've been boondoggled by a increasingly more and more cynical Republican Party and a admittedly dysfunctional Democratic Party, not providing a particularly good alternative other than to say, well, you don't want to slide into the fascism that these people are pushing. So there's lots of stuff. I think that when we think about companies and workplaces, the measure ought to be, how are things for the people at the bottom? How are they being treated? How are they being compensated? How are they being protected? It shouldn't be just about how much revenue is being generated or, what do the people at the top think? The people at the top are always happy with how shit is going, right? Unless they're not making as much money or they're winding up, losing out on some power struggle. We should be thinking about, what are things like for the secretarial staff? What are things like for the janitors? What are things like for, in restaurants, the dishwashers and busboys and people, at those ends? I think that's very important. All right. Yeah, Andre, what are some helpful books someone should read to define a solid political position? I mean, I don't know. I don't think that just reading a particular curriculum is by itself going to help you develop whatever a solid political position is. There's books out there that provide overviews of political philosophy, and they're usually at a fairly high level of generality, but they can be okay, I guess. I don't keep up on that kind of contemporary literature. I mean, I would say, reading and thinking about without trying to take as like the blueprint for what politics ought to look like, classical all the way up to like 20th and 21st century literature in political theory, broadly speaking, could be useful. But does any one book stand out? Not for me. So, let's see here. Ethan says, is there any advice you could give for getting out of a rut of not reading philosophy or learning? This is going to sound kind of silly, but there's really no substitute for this. The way you get out of that rut is by actually doing some reading. You make time for it. I do actually have some like nuts and bolts advice. I use a Google Calendar for scheduling what I do during the day, my work, my video production, reading, exercise, time with my wife, events that we're going to, client appointments, and I will. So I found out with exercise, I had to create appointments for myself as if I was meeting with a client, and that allowed me to stick to it. Otherwise, I was letting it slide. So I would do something like that for yourself for reading. And you don't have to read the Phenomenology of Spirit. Don't pick something that's like super hard. Pick something that is more workable. Let's see what I got over here. So, here's Philip K. Dick's, short stories. Philosophical stuff going on in those, right? This one's actually got We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is a great story. I would, start with stuff like that. Or I mentioned this survey book where Julia Annis is telling you all about ancient philosophy and their views on the virtues and habits and morality and life as a whole. If you just read some of this and be gentle with yourself. You might have to read stuff over several times before it makes sense or sticks. That's okay. Sometimes you got to do that. So Andre says, thank you. Thank you, Andre. That's very, very nice of you. Impious Design. Oh, it's got a thing about reading faster. Yeah. Zeitgeist. How would conservatives today not be conservative, though they believe in traditional morality? No, they don't. Most of them believe basically in a few little bits and pieces of it, and they don't follow it. I mean, traditional morality would say, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't rob people of what's due to them. And I mean, if you're voting Republican, you're voting for things that directly contradicts all of that. So that's not conservative at all. I mean, great examples are like the whole NRA, gun nutter, Second Amendment thing. The NRA, when I was a kid, was for gun control. And it was about hunters and responsible gun owners. It wasn't this corrupt organization shelling out lots of money to basically almost every Republican and some Democrats to essentially buy their way in and cover up the gun industry. That's not conservative. That's actually radical. That's a radical change. So, conservatives, people who call themselves conservatives today, they don't believe in any sort of traditional morality. That's all just smoke and lies bullshit at this point. I mean, they might have been able to claim that 20 years ago, but nobody should be fooled today. That's not to say that their opposition is automatically, for traditional morality. And why would it be good to be for traditional morality in the first place? A lot of traditional morality is, bigotry and bullshit. You got to be very selective. If you're like a virtue ethicist or you're interested in, living a philosophical life, you've got to have left behind the people that call themselves conservatives today. I mean, so many of them are just reprobates and degenerates. And but it's often been like that, right? In history. So, all right. Juniton says, any thoughts on talk of grounding in metaphysics? It seems metaphysics has taken a very neo-Aristotelian turn over the last 10 years. What do you think of the contemporary state of metaphysics? I don't worry about the contemporary state of metaphysics. So I don't know what that means or looks like. And I'm pretty surprised to hear about a neo-Aristotelian turn, because neo-Aristotelians have been a minority for a very long time, as far as I can tell. And grounding in metaphysics, I don't really worry about that so much. Every time that I've seen somebody claim to provide a grounding for things, it never really turns out to be such. So I'm more interested in things where the questions are kind of smaller, like what is human nature? Is there such a thing? What does it look like? Does it develop? How complicated is it? How do we distinguish reality from appearances. Maybe appearances have their own kind of reality, those sorts of things. I don't worry about like foundation or grounding or things like that myself. So, all right. Stigmaris says, thanks for your lessons. I'm a recent high school graduate going into college, and I thank you so much for the videos you made. I love philosophy. Hope to learn so much more. Well, I mean, in a way, you're in a great position because hopefully, fate willing, you've got your whole life ahead of you, and you've got decades and decades to read and discuss and study and apply and experiment with at least a portion, because all we can do now is like get a little portion of the philosophy that's out there. And how exciting for you. That's really wonderful. I mean, one of the the few regrets I have, and no, it's not really a regret or a complaint. It's just that, it's too bad, right? Is the fact that as somebody who's 51 years old, going to turn 52 in just a week or two, I got maybe another 30 years, and I kind of wish I had more time. Given that now I have a really solid conception of what it is that I want to do, but I got to do it with this body that's slowly breaking down, and it's got a lot of like chronic pain, and I can't remember things quite as well as I used to. So yeah, enjoy it while you can. Stigmaris, make as much use of it as you can. All right, Serum, completely out of topic. This is an AMA. You can ask about whatever you want. What is your favorite music album? That is almost impossible for me to say. I don't even have a favorite band anymore. I think if you'd asked teenage or 20-something Greg, it probably would have been Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind, because Iron Maiden was my favorite band, and Peace of Mind is a really, really great album. I actually nowadays, if you ask me like what's your favorite Iron Maiden album, I would say Killers. Although I do like Bruce Dickinson's singing better than Paul Di'Anno's. But I don't even have like a favorite band. And if you were to ask me like what are your top 5 or top 10, there's bands that would get in there, but it changes from one week to the next. So there's a lot of non-metal bands that I really love too, like New Model Army, for example, or guess who I'm going to get to see over my birthday weekend down in Chicago? Duran Duran. So I don't really have a good answer to that sort of thing. Joel says, what's your opinion of Marx's 1815 Paris manuscripts in general? Do you accept Marx's critique of Hegel, or is it not your area of interest? I mean, that's a weird dichotomy. Do you accept it, or is it not an area of your interest? It could be an area of your interest, and you could still not accept it. As a matter of fact, you can research people who and work on people and teach them who you totally disagree with. I pretty routinely teach David Hume, and I enjoy reading him, but I disagree with him fundamentally about many different things. So, I mean, do I agree with Marx's critique of Hegel? Yeah, kind of not. I mean, I think that Marx is a pretty all over the map kind of writer, and that one of the challenges of Marxists, and Marxists come in all different varieties, is to figure out what should we actually buy, what should we not, how do we put this stuff together, how do we apply it. It's complicated by the fact that Marx tried to kind of bogart, the whole radical progressive movement. I mean, you can see this, for example, in the Communist Manifesto, where it's like these kinds of socialism are all wrong, or they're not completely wrong, but here's where they go bad. This is why what we're putting forward is the best thing. So yeah. It looks like Joel asked that same question twice. Impious design. Is continuing a conversation. 1234. What do you think about Helen Keller conspiracy theories? Many Zoomers think that either Keller or handlers lied about her ability to know things or communicate. This is something completely new to me. I had no idea that there were Helen Keller conspiracy theories. I think that I'll say this. If that's the sort of shit, given the world that we're living in and the many different things that you could be like devoting your time to, if that's the focus of somebody's, decision to apply their intellect, that's probably kind of telling about them. I don't really care about Helen Keller one way or the other. And I find it bizarre that that this would become an object of controversy, but I suppose that anything can become an object of controversy, right? So, all right. Ben says, I'm starting a local philosophy club at my local public library. Any advice on which direction to take things? I think it'd be good to keep things pretty open-ended, at least in the beginning. Yeah, that's a good idea. I would like, what I would suggest doing is maybe having something that you use as a focal point, right? So it's not like totally open-ended. You want to maybe give them a short reading, and the library can probably help out with that, like providing people with photocopies, because they do this in great books clubs. So you could say like, oh, today we're going to look at, the Apology of Socrates, and we're going to discuss these ideas in it. And then, creating handouts for people. People love to have takeaways. So that can be quite useful. You might also look into the Society of Philosophers in America, SOPHIA. They support and promote and provide resources for people doing kind of general interest philosophy clubs, provided that they're oriented towards promoting dialogue. So that would be a good thing to do. And you realize that you're going to have kooks come in who have some very strongly held but poorly formed ideas, and they're going to want to communicate them because they're lonely people. And you don't have to like refute them. You can just say, all right, well, that's fine, we're talking about this over here, not that, as you see me do sometimes in my videos, right? That might be a useful thing to start learning how to do, because you're going to keep getting them coming in. Further wrote, back to phenomenology. What do you think of phenomenology as a study? I think that phenomenology is such a vast field with so many different ways in which it's done, and so many different authors and so many different traditions, that there isn't a what do I think of it. It depends on who you're thinking about. Who, are we talking about Husserl? I mentioned Husserl is worth reading. I don't know that you have to necessarily read everything that has been published by the guy, let alone everything that he wrote, because reading everything that he wrote means going to Leuven and learning, his shorthand and pouring through the archives, which has to be, some really demanding and also dull work. But, reading Husserl, reading the Cartesian Meditations is worth doing. The Crisis manuscript is certainly worth reading. I find Heidegger and Max Scheler and Edith Stein and people like that much more exciting to read. Gabriel Marcel as well. But different strokes for different folks. So, all right. Max says, I recently read up on some of Leibniz's ideas and found him interesting. How do you think one should approach his work, especially since his works are mostly essays? Well, read them. Realize that he is writing in a context in which there's important debates going on between several different modern philosophies, or broadly speaking, and some, stuff that's coming from ancient and medieval. Leibniz, for example, thinks that it's foolish to throw away the idea of substantial forms just because the scholastics seem to be a bit moribund when it comes to that. He's got some really fascinating ideas, and a lot of what he does write is essays. There's also that, like, you could call it almost like a manifesto, the monadology. He also, writes long treatises, like his Theodicy, and he's got a lot of letters that he writes back and forth as well that are pretty interesting to look at too. So yeah, and keep in mind that Leibniz is he's responding to and reacting to a lot of other thinkers of the time. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who's your favorite president? What are some reasons why? I don't think I have a favorite president. I don't lionize them as great men or stuff like that. What I want to see in a president is doing the right sorts of things, steering us towards a better union than what we've currently got. So, yeah. I mean, I could pull a guy out of the air and say Abraham Lincoln. But, Lincoln had his flaws as well. So I don't know that he's actually a favorite, because I don't know that I have a favorite president. Petros, this is a kind of funny one. Do you have any procrastination tips? I'm taking it you don't mean tips on how to procrastinate, and that you've already got that down as well, which I do too. Yeah, so I do have I'll give you a couple tips. One is, so you started procrastinating and you have a tendency towards it, realizing that, and then choosing to, do something in the present about it is quite helpful. You don't have to absolutely clear your schedule or your to-do list or something like that of all the things that you haven't gotten to in order to make some progress. You don't want to use the progress that you are making as a way of not thinking about the things that you still have to do, of course, right? Because that's a typical procrastination trick. Oh, I vacuumed the carpet, so therefore the emails I need to get to, it's okay if I put them off. That's bad logic. But I would say one of the things that does happen with procrastination is, especially when you're thinking about writing a paper or writing an email to somebody, you don't do it on time. And then you're like, oh man, in order to make it up, I need to really do a good job on this in the future. So I better find a good time to do that. And then I'll write the perfect email or the perfect paper, or, I'll clean this place up so much it'll be it's never been lived in or something like that. That is going to screw you up. So as soon as you find yourself doing that, procrastination and perfectionism often go hand in hand. You want to be attentive to that and then say, I don't have to do a perfect job on this. I just need to get something done for this, right? That's, a real achievement, even if it's not perfect, is way better than an ideal, not real, perfect achievement. So maybe that'll help. Utis, I don't really understand Aristotle's idea of the formal cause. Could you explain? Formal cause is the structure of the thing, and you could say it's workings, and the material is you could, here we use this sort of visual metaphor. The material is underneath, the formal cause is superimposed on it. Now you have a substance. That's the way that Aristotle talks about it. And it's going to vary from thing to thing to thing, right? Obviously, The soul being the form of the body is not exactly the same thing as the structure of the water bottle being the form of the material that this water bottle is composed of, or the, overarching levels of structure, whether, just that of the sentence, the word, the paragraph, and the book. The meaning of the book is one thing. Then we also have the actual structure of it. So there's a number of different ways of having formal causality. Maybe that'll help out. It probably, one of the ways I think people get screwed up with Aristotelian causality is they're like, a formal cause is only one kind of thing. A final cause is only one kind of thing, and everything has to fit into that bucket. Well, it's a lot more complicated when we look at what Aristotle actually says, and then when we try to apply it in the world that we live in. Serum, what do you make of Nietzsche's Zarathustra? I recently listened to the book. I was impressed by the way in which it was written than actually believing in its ideas. Oh, that's a good distinction, right? You can say Nietzsche's a great stylist. You don't necessarily have to buy into the ideas to appreciate the style. Nietzsche's not a systematic writer. Thus Zarathustra has a lot of discourses. And, you could buy one of them without buying all of them, or even part of a discourse without buying the totality of the single discourse. That's certainly possible. Mark has a bit of note here. I'm busy reading Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment. I read for about an hour each night, getting through about 2 or 3 pages each day. See, there's a great example of somebody who's plowing through a difficult work. The third critique is, in parts, you're like, holy shit, what the hell's going on here, right? And other parts are a little bit more straightforward, but some of it is really both mind-blowing and mind-boggling. So, yeah. Abi Manu, I got highest marks in logic, but hot bad marks in epistemology. How to study epistemology? I don't know. There's no one way to study epistemology. You can get yourself a textbook, I suppose. You can, read papers in it. You can put yourself together a curriculum and, start with maybe some of the pre-Socratics and move all the way forward. There's no way to study any of these things. And who knows what your instructors are looking for. It's not as if there's a consensus about what testing looks like. All right. Matthew, have you engaged with the work of Peter Sloterdijk? I have not, so that's kind of a non-starter there. Forget about me. Can you explain what's Aristotle's take on time? No, probably not. I'd have to go back, and in order to do a decent job on that, I'd have to review some stuff. He's got that famous phrase, time is the number of motion, so it's quantitative, right? And we're moving in time, you could say, or time is passing. But I'd really, in order to say more than those generalizations, I'd have to go back to the physics and spend some time there. Siddharth, what do you think of the hospital case by Thompson regarding the trolley problem? What do you mean, what do I think about it? Do I think that it's a good case? Do I think that somebody should do something in the case? People, all these what do you think about questions that people seem to be asking in this one. We gotta get a little bit more down to proverbial brass tacks. Chris, I saw that you mentioned Philip K. Dick's We Can Remember for You Wholesale. Do you have any general philosophical takeaways from it? I do not. It's not a philosophical treatise, and I don't know that Dick is trying to teach us or argue about philosophy in it. It's a cool story, right? And there's interesting ideas that are being brought up, but I don't have philosophical takeaways, I would say. Alfonso, can you recommend some bibliography around modern practical reason to overcome the instrumental reason for modern Stoicism logic actualization? I don't even know what you're asking about there. So no, I don't have a bibliography, and I'm not a bibliographer. A bibliography is a well worked out, well researched document. So no. This is from Aid. Hope you're doing well. Any thoughts on the classic trivium model of education and/or general thoughts on how you think education should be? Yeah, I think most of the people doing the trivium are people you should run away from because they are enamored of a long, outmoded articulation of what education looks like. And they may be reacting against some bad tendencies within modern education, but when you listen to them talk, they usually get modern education pretty wrong. And they'll like bash, Dewey, and they haven't read Dewey, and I would say in our time, a lot of the people who talk about classical education they're hacks. They're full of shit. They may like praise Aristotle and they may read a little bit of Aristotle, but they usually don't understand Aristotle. I'll put it to you this way: the people who were teaching in the trivium, which involves literature or grammar, right? Both the way that you would actually learn grammar in the medieval trivium was by not just like doing grammar stuff, but actually reading great literature and using that as examples, and then rhetoric, and then logic or dialectic, right? I think the people who are teaching in that would call a lot of the people who are doing it today blockheads and kick them out of their institution. So I'm not enamored of it. And I say this from personal experience with a lot of people who are into that. Now, these are generalizations. Are there some people who are in good faith and who are actually quite competent when it comes to these matters? Sure, but they're not the majority as far as I can tell. Do I have any general thoughts on how education ought to be? Probably not. I don't do philosophy of education that much, except in an incidental way. And I would have to think quite a bit about. I don't think that there's a one size fits all approach to education. I think that it's good to have multiple models out there, but they should be in communication with each other, and there should be some accountability too, right? Noah Van Hooser, is Zen a philosophy? Well, to begin with, Zen or Chan in Chinese, where it originated, is a important school among many, many other schools of Mahayana Buddhist, whatever you want to call it, religion, philosophy, way of life. I think a lot of people who talk about Zen here in the West don't have a clue about what they're talking about. They've read some, Alan Watts or, some Thomas Merton or somebody else who had some engagement with it. And then they think that like sitting around and drinking tea and spouting nonsense is Zen, when actually it's a very rigorous way to live. You go to a Zen monastery, they're going to put you through your paces and you're going to read a lot of sutras and all of that sort of stuff. By the way, Zen, or Chan, in its contemporary forms, and for a long time in like Chinese forms and elsewhere, isn't just a particular school. It also takes on things from other schools, even like Pure Land. So is it a philosophy? Better to think of it as a set of different philosophies capable of different kinds of interpretation. And it's something that you really got to put a lot of time into, time and work and study in order to talk about competently, I think. Paul Heinrich, I just can't understand why Aristotle's books on ethics are supposed to be important. To me, much of what he says is either common sense or completely arbitrary. Am I mad? No, just at a place where I was when I was an undergraduate before I came to realize that the problem was not with Aristotle, but with me. And that I was not a careful reader and that I wasn't really getting what he was saying adequately. So, stick with it. Maybe you'll discover stuff that you've missed out on, I would say. And you could say the same thing, by the way, about many other philosophers. People mentioned Leibniz earlier. There's quite a few people out there who disparage Leibniz and say, "Oh, he's not that important. He's not that interesting." And, when I hear that sort of thing, I'm like, well, I mean, I realize that he is, and it's too bad that you're missing out on that sort of thing. Russell, what do you think of Spinoza? I think Spinoza is an interesting philosopher. I don't buy most of what he has to say, and I think I will say this. I think there's a lot of people who are into Spinoza, but they don't really understand Spinoza well. And he's what we could call a philosopher with an aura, just like Hegel. A lot of people are like, "Oh my gosh, Hegel, he's so brilliant. The phenomenology, you have to read this." And you talk to them and you're like, "Okay, so what did you read?" "Oh, the master-slave dialectic." And you're like, "Oh, okay, that's it." So this little tiny sliver of the book, that's what you're saying is so genius, so brilliant, this little tiny bit. I think there's a lot of people who do that with Spinoza. I think there's people who do that with Nick Land, and I'm going to do some writing about this eventually. Spinoza is not somebody you could hero worship. Spinoza's a philosopher who's worth reading and studying and figuring out whether you buy into his rather implausible pantheistic, mechanistic doctrine, or whether you don't. That's what I would say. Zach Elias, do you have any thoughts on getting an MA in philosophy? I mean, it's certainly something you can do. I don't have thoughts on it as such. Mr. Argentino, what was coronavirus? Why are you asking me? I mean, there's all sorts of people out there. I mean, do you think that coronavirus is gone? People are still getting sick and dying of it right now. So, Noah Van Hooser, is Sellers' attack on foundationalism successful? I don't know. Ask the me from graduate school, back in the late 90s when I actually knew what he had to say about it, because people I knew were into it. So I have no clue. Zugi asks, are you familiar with Nassim Taleb's books? Unfortunately, yes. I think he's kind of a guru type, and I'm pretty unimpressed with him, as I am with most of these contemporary gurus. Zeitgeist, oh, he's talking to somebody else. Let's see. Alfonso Stoa, what's the modern Stoicism's take? There is no modern Stoicism's take. So let's stop right there, right? Modern Stoicism is a vast movement that comprises a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of approaches and stuff like that. What is the take on the global collapse, environmental, climate, energetic, atomic? I don't know that there's an atomic collapse happening. So let's just stick with environmental and climate, which are both connected together. Do you think it's linked to anarcho-primitivism? No, it's not linked to anarcho-primitivism, because modern Stoics are not, for the most part, anarcho-primitivists. They think we live in a society, and that we have to take the society that we live in and make sense out of it. There's some people that are doing some writing on this. Christopher Gill, for example, Kai Whiting. I mean, it's clear that we should care about the environment, and that it's foolish to pretend like nothing is happening. I mean, here in Wisconsin, we hardly get any real snow anymore, and you can tell that the climate is changing considerably. This, by the way, is going to be one of the good places to move to as sea levels rise and it gets hotter here in the United States. So we're going to have to figure out what to do with all those immigrants from the red states where people don't believe in that sort of thing, but are going to be clamoring to live here. And that involves matters of justice, right? So we can think about those sorts of matters. But is there like a standard modern Stoic take? There isn't. El Kettering, you've mentioned you see Derrida as a second-rate philosopher, which you say isn't a bad thing. Which of his views do you find persuasive or interesting? What keeps him from first-rate? I mean, I like Derrida's early rigorous stuff. I don't like his silly bullshit middle period, and I'm not that convinced about his later stuff with the turn back to religion and politics. So, the properly interpreted, there's nothing outside of the text. Brilliant insight, right? I don't know that I said that Derrida was second, right? I think you're probably blurring that with somebody else, but I think that a lot of Derrida's middle period stuff when he was a star is kind of garbage. I think that his later stuff is interesting, but it would have benefited from being edited. Derrida, the same thing happened to him as happens to so many other people. It starts out doing really interesting, well-informed, rigorous work that you can look at and be like, oh yeah, that's good stuff. Wow, there's some real insights there. This guy knows a lot of shit, right? And then he becomes a big deal. And then because of that, he starts believing the hype that everybody's saying about him. And then he just starts churning out self-indulgent kind of bullshit, which occasionally has a good piece in it here and there, right? But that's the big problem. Ruben says, do you still find it weird after all these years as a philosophy professor that the majority never ask themselves the deep what and why, let alone doing it consistently? I never found it weird. I didn't find it weird as an undergraduate. I didn't find it weird as a graduate student. And I didn't find it weird as a professor. And I kind of look at it as if you're, if you're reading historical philosophy, isn't that what Plato says? Isn't that what Aristotle says? Why would it be weird? Why would we assume that people would just naturally gravitate to this difficult, complicated, doesn't have easy answers, or if they do, usually the easy answers are the wrong ones? Why would we assume that is, the default for human beings, when it's never been the default for human beings, that they just sort of like get philosophy or get interested in it? So, all right, let's see here. Just skipped a little bit. Russell Henry Bieber, what are the books every philosopher should read? I don't think there is a list of books that every philosopher should read. I mean, you can bet that it's probably a good idea to read Plato, right? Do you have to read all of his dialogues? I don't think so. I mean, we started out early on talking about the Euthydemus. It's worth reading. Is it worth reading as much as reading the Symposium? I would stick with the Symposium, or even the Protagoras, or the Gorgias. But yeah, I don't try to come up with these reading lists that everybody should have to have. Bicameral Monk, do you have any thoughts on psychological egoism? Do you think it's circular, trivially true? I don't even think it's true, because psychological egoism says that everything that everybody does is done, out of self-interest at bottom. And I don't think that's actually the case. I think the justifications of it are usually rather circular. And I think that, you always got to ask, why would somebody be so invested in claiming that, That's kind of a funny thing to think about. All right, so we got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to kind of skip around a bit, and I'm not going to try to read everything. because no way we're going to get to it all. So let's pick out some fun questions. Well, here's a good one from Kahan Sudev. Did Hegel really come up with thesis, antithesis, and synthesis? He did not. As a matter of fact, you're rarely going to find anything like that in his work. He does like triadic structures, but that's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Fichte, who predates Hegel, uses that, but not as consistently. And it's kind of garbage Hegelians and popularizers who stick with this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. I will say that Marx contributed to that as well. Popularizers of philosophy like William Durant, who's The Story of Philosophy is a bestseller. You can find in bookstores all over the place. Is a careless writer who certainly is contributing to that. Kobelston, by the way, in his History of Philosophy, discusses this and says, yeah, not really there in Hegel. So not all historians get that wrong. Let's see what else we got. Nico, is proeresis something that we really control? If the assumptions we control it absolute according to the Stoics true? If no, what really influences it? You got a category mistake here. Proeresis is not something we really control or really don't control. It is us controlling it. So, it's sort of like when people are like, so God is the first cause, the cause of everything. What caused God? And you're like, did you not hear first cause? So the question you're asking already shows you're getting something kind of mixed up there. Obviously, lots of things flow into proeresis and influence it. But, both for Aristotle, by the way, who was the first person to use proeresis as a technical term, and for the Stoics, and for other people who use similar terms like voluntas or will, we control it. It is how we control things. It is something that controls itself. So yeah. Let's see. Christine Joy Garcia, what are your thoughts on Stoic pragmatists? I think that's kind of a mishmash of stuff. I've got Locke's Stoic pragmatism, which I have to review. I know that the historical pragmatists messed up in their interpretations of Stoicism. And I think you could just do Stoicism without having to make it into something else. If you want to be a pragmatist, go be a pragmatist. If you want to be an existentialist, go be an existentialist. Being a Stoic isn't something that you sprinkle a little bit on, like putting some mozzarella on your pizza or to put some Parmesan on your pizza. It's already got mozzarella, right? And then call it, it's a Parmesan pizza. No, you gotta, you're taking a little bit of stuff from something else. I don't really buy the project. Let's see here. So this is from Tristan. Hero worship in philosophy or popular philosophy sounds like a great video idea. Do you think hero worship, like you described, was significant as it was in the past for philosophers as it is now? You can always find it. Except, in times when philosophy, there isn't much of it going on. I mean, if you're in the Middle Ages, during the Carolinginian Renaissance, when it's, mostly monks who are literate and trying to, spread this to society now that a little bit of peace has been attained under Charlemagne, and there's going to be a reconstitution of learning. Not a lot of people are worrying about philosophy at that time. So not a lot of hero worship going on. You kind of need to have a literate, book reading public in order to have that sort of thing going on. And when you do, you find all sorts of superficial takes where people are claiming that they're into this philosopher. They've got the best solution for everything. and they don't really know what they're talking about. They're, kind of fakers. So I think that's common. Bottomhead, what do you make of Republicans asking Democrats to define woman? Totally in bad faith. I mean, we should focus more on how Republicans actually treat women, and the misogyny that very casual and ingrained misogyny that you find even among Republican women, who are often like surprised. Oh, I can't believe that they treated me so badly when I've been like selling out my fellow women. Similar things going on as well. Let's see. A lot of back and forth about that. Somebody has a funny thing. Cheese rafts from Wisconsin to rescue the rest of the U.S. in the coming floods. I mean, we're not going to have coming floods. It's just that sea levels are going to rise, and that is going to like turn a lot of Louisiana into swamp again, and coastal cities are going to have a lot of problems. And places where it's hot and they're super dependent on air conditioning and all the power supply that goes into that are going to become even more so. A lot of arable farmland will become unarable, and other places will become, places where you can grow things. Donkey asking for a friend who's kind of modern, mad as a hatter Diogenes, who wants to shift to something a little more accessible to the normie fans out there. Any suggestions on rebranding? I don't even know what that's quite asking. And Diogenes could be Diogenes, and even Diogenes was kind of a prick. So people who fancy themselves Diogenes are usually like cheap knockoff pricks. And it's not a very good way to live. You see similar stuff with people who idolize Charles Bukowski and, try to live like him. And you're like, that's not really going to work out for you. And I don't want to hang out with you anymore. How do you rebrand? Kind of get your proverbial crap together, right? Decide what actually matters in your life and prioritize that. If that involves like restoring relationships, I mean, getting into a 12-step program and doing some of the stuff that they do could be very helpful, like taking a ruthless moral inventory. I mean, you don't have to be an addict to think that that's super valuable to do. Going around to the people who you've wronged. I mean, if you're Diogenes, even as Diogenes himself, you've probably wronged quite a few people. You might have been speaking truth to power, or, holding the mirror up to society, but you probably acted like a prick to quite a few people who didn't deserve it. So, fixing that might be the way to do it, I guess. This is nice from Philomena. Thank you so much for your channel. I'm fast approaching my 70th year. At 52, you still have plenty of time. Your channel has made my retirement more productive than it otherwise would be. That's very nice to read. I'm glad that the videos have been useful and helpful and hopefully enjoyable for you. And yeah, some of us get like super lucky. Alistair McIntyre is still out there kicking at I think 94 years old, and apparently still has all of his marbles, so to speak. Obviously, he doesn't have the body of a 20-year-old or even a 50-year-old, but he seems to be doing okay. Anthony Long, another great example. Julia Annas, who I mentioned, I don't know how old she is, but she's certainly emeritus age and still doing good work. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of hope for us. I mean, a lot of it winds up being luck and genetics and things like that. And, it seems like my birth families lived pretty long. I kind of wish that I had my mom's family, Lemry's genes, because a lot of my grandfather's generation lived well into their 90s, but I'm not genetically related to, so we get what we get, right? Unfortunately. Oh, here's a good question. DC Reverett, how would you suggest using close readings with students who have zero experience with it? That's a great question to go out on. So you got to be able to suggest to them what a close reading should look like and what it should provide them with. And maybe finding a few short examples of close readings that other people are doing would be helpful. And I like to describe close readings as we're not just sticking close to the text. When we run into problems or questions or things that don't make sense, one of the things we do is we use the text itself as a resource rather than just going immediately to an encyclopedia or secondary literature. We say, all right, so Plato's confusing me here. Is there anything else in Plato's texts that, or even just this text, that helps me understand what's going on? And odds are that there often is, right? And so that can be a very helpful component. You could also suggest to them too, the goal of a close reading is not to actually like explain the entire text. It's usually to focus in on some aspect that you find particularly interesting or compelling or worthwhile that you want to bring to light and say, there's something here that I care about. Maybe that's a good part of it, right? Affective. Maybe the care could be like, what the hell is this crap? I can't figure out what this guy is saying, right? But it could also be, this is a really interesting idea, and I don't fully understand it, but I want to make sense of it as best as I can within the scope of this text. So that those might be ways to get like total beginners to understand what's going on in a close reading. And that is a really great question. Something I should probably think about for my own students, because I'm teaching a couple classes where close reading is something I want the students to be doing. I'm incidentally, I'm going to be teaching 4 classes this coming semester. I got asked very last minute, not even a week ago, by Marquette University to take on 3 classes for them, 2 of which are a new upper level core class, and I'm still kind of figuring out what I'm going to do with that. It's sort of a problem-based learning thing. And then the other one is a foundations in philosophy, which is, intro to philosophy with some extra bells and whistles. And for Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, I'm teaching philosophies of human nature. And so, I'll probably have my students do close readings in the intro and the philosophies of human nature. So maybe I should, this is a good occasion, maybe put together a video about that. So, all right. Don says, close reading beer goggles for the win. Now, beer goggles means something a little bit different usually. It's like hooking up with somebody at beer, or not at beer time, at bar time, because you drank so much beer or shots or whatever that you're willing to sleep with somebody that you would normally find below your standards. Can we make a good metaphor of that to something about close reading? I'd have to think about that. Nothing suggests itself right off the bat. So, all right. So this is a good place to end. I didn't get to everybody's questions, but got to as many of them as I could, and hope all of you have a great time. I'm gonna head off, get something to eat, and then I've got my philosophy chat for Patreon supporters coming up, and then I got to get to the tons and tons of work awaiting me, some of which are the product, to go back to one of the questions, of procrastination, of having put things off that I shouldn't have put off, and now I got to pay the price. So, all right, I'll see all of you, and hope you have a great rest of the weekend.